The courtroom smelled like old paper and disinfectant, the kind they use in hospitals to make you forget you're human. The air was too cold for a room full of people, but no one complained. They sat stiff-neat waiting for someone else's life to crack open in front of them. Mine already had. I was in a suit that didn't fit the way it used to. The collar pressed my throat when I swallowed. My hands rested on the table like they belonged to somebody else. Fingers steady, knuckles, pale nails, trimmed too clean. I'd learned a long time ago that shaking only makes people think you deserve what's happening to you. Across the aisle, my wife sat with her attorney hair, brushed smooth, eyes red, in the careful way red eyes can be. She wasn't crying. She was wearing the idea of crying. The tissue in her hand remained unused, a prop waiting for its cue. I didn't look at her for long. The bailiff called the room to order. The judge entered, robe swaying, expression practiced. He didn't look at any one person long enough to feel like a person. The clerk started reading names, case numbers, dates. Each word landed like a stamp on a file folder. Then my name. Hearing it spoken out loud in that room felt like being identified at a crime scene. I listened as they talked about me like I wasn't there. Terms like custody, best interest, credible testimony. I heard pattern of behavior and emotional environment. I heard the quiet, careful way my wife's attorney said my daughter's name, as if he were introducing a witness in a murder trial. My daughter. When the judge asked if the petitioner had any witnesses, my wife's attorney stood. He was young in that polished, expensive way, the kind of man who knew exactly how to lower his voice so people leaned in. "Yes, Your Honor," he said. "We'd like to call the child." The words didn't make sense at first, like someone had spoken a foreign language I almost understood. The child. The bailiff opened the side door, and my daughter walked in. Not a woman, not an adult, still a child even if the world insisted on making her older every time it needed something from her. Her dress was pale blue, too formal for a Tuesday morning. Her hair was done in a neat braid, not a single strand loose, the kind of braid you get when someone's been practicing, when someone's hands are firm and patient and controlling. She didn't look at me right away. She walked in small, careful steps like the floor might betray her if she moved too fast. She held her arms close to her sides, hands clasped, fingers twisting once, then stopping like she'd been told not to fidget. My mouth went dry. I didn't stand. I didn't wave. I didn't call her name. Every instinct in me screamed to reach for her, to pull her close, to tell her she was safe. But the people in that room didn't see fathers. They saw risks. They saw accusations. They saw headlines that hadn't been written yet. The bailiff guided her to the witness stand. He adjusted the microphone. He asked her to raise her right hand. She did it slowly, like the motion had weight. "Do you swear to tell the truth? The whole truth? And nothing but the truth?" She answered in a voice that was too clear. "I do." I felt something shift in my chest, a dull movement like a door closing. My wife's attorney approached her with a soft smile. He didn't look like someone who enjoyed hurting people. That was the point. He looked like someone who would apologize while he did it. "Sweetheart," he said gently, "can you tell the judge why you don't want to live with your father?" The question should have been impossible. My daughter's eyes found the edge of the table in front of her. Not the judge, not the attorney, not me. The table, like it was the safest thing in the room. Then she spoke. "My father scares me," she said. The words hit like a slap-sharp public absolute. A quiet murmur traveled across the benches behind me. I didn't turn. I didn't give them the satisfaction of seeing my face. My wife's attorney nodded slowly, as if he were hearing something heartbreaking but expected. "And how does he scare you?" My daughter took a breath. I watched her tongue press against her teeth for a split second, like she was finding the exact start of a sentence. "He gets angry," she said. "He yells. He throws things." It wasn't just what she said. It was the rhythm, the placement, the way the words came out in full, neat lines, not like a child searching for the truth, like a child reciting it. My wife's attorney walked 2 steps closer to the witness stand. "Has he ever hurt you?" My daughter's hands tightened. I saw her fingers dig into each other hard enough to whiten. Her eyes flicked just once toward the gallery, toward the place where my wife sat. Then she looked forward again. "Yes," she whispered. The judge leaned forward slightly. The pen in his hand stopped moving. How the attorney asked softer now. My daughter's chin trembled exactly once. A single tear slid down her cheek, slow and perfect, like it had been timed. He grabbed my arm, she said. He squeezed so hard it left marks. My heart didn't race, it sank. There's a difference. Panic is fast. This was heavy. This was drowning. I opened my mouth without realizing it. Not to argue, not to speak over her, just to breathe. But my attorney touched my wrist under the table, a warning without words. I closed my mouth. The attorney nodded, eyes, sympathetic voice, warm. Do you remember what he said when he did that? My daughter blinked and blinked again, the way children do when they're trying not to cry. She swallowed. He said she began and then paused. The pause was too long, like she'd lost her place. The attorney waited, patient, kind. My daughter's gaze dipped for a second down and to the right, like she was looking at something only she could see. Then she continued. He said, "You'll do what I tell you or you'll regret it." A hush fell over the room. Not silence. Judgment. The kind of silence that turns into decisions. My wife's attorney stepped back as if he'd done something noble. No further questions. Your Honor. My daughter sat there breathing in short, controlled pulls, her shoulders barely moving. The judge stared at her with a look that was supposed to be compassionate, but it made my skin crawl. Compassion can be a weapon when it's aimed in the wrong direction. I finally looked at my daughter. Her eyes were wet. Her face was pale. Her lips trembled slightly. But there was something else there too, a tightness around her jaw as if she were holding back a different kind of emotion. Fear, yes, but not of me. Fear of getting it wrong, fear of forgetting a line. I felt my fingers curl against the wood of the table, not in anger, in restraint, in the desperate effort to keep myself from breaking open in front of strangers. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This wasn't a messy divorce. This wasn't a family falling apart in private. This was my child being used in public. And the worst part was the room believed her. I didn't stand up when the judge dismissed my daughter from the witness stand. I stayed seated because standing felt like admitting something I hadn't done. Because if I moved too fast, I might say her name out loud. And once that happened, I wouldn't be able to stop myself from saying everything else. She walked past me without looking. The bailiff held the door for her. My wife reached out instinctively, placing a hand on our daughter's shoulder, guiding her like she was fragile glass. The gesture looked loving to everyone else. I noticed something different. My daughter stiffened for just a second when her mother touched her. No one else caught it. Not the judge, not the attorneys, not the strangers behind me who had already decided what kind of man I was. But I did. That small reaction told me more than all the testimony combined. I stared straight ahead as my attorney prepared for cross-examination, though I already knew how little it would matter right now. In family court, truth doesn't always arrive first. Sometimes it comes limping in at the end long after damage has been done. The judge cleared his throat and addressed the room, speaking carefully, as if each word carried weight. He mentioned concern. He mentioned seriousness. He mentioned the child's emotional well-being. He didn't mention me. That was fine. I wasn't here to be mentioned. I wasn't here to argue, and I wasn't here to win today. I had learned something years ago, long before this courtroom, long before the divorce papers, long before my daughter was old enough to be asked questions she shouldn't have been asked. People who rush to defend themselves usually do it because they're afraid the truth won't hold up on its own. I wasn't afraid of the truth. I was afraid of what it would cost my daughter to hear it spoken too soon. So I stayed quiet. I let the room believe what it wanted. I let my wife's attorney relax in his chair, satisfied with how things were unfolding. I let my wife dab her eyes for the first time, finally using the tissue she'd been holding all morning. She thought this was the hardest part. She thought once our daughter spoke, the rest would take care of itself. What she didn't know, what no one in that room knew, was that this wasn't the first time I'd heard those words. You'll do what I tell you, or you'll regret it. I'd heard them before, not shouted, not in anger, said calmly, repeated carefully. Not by me, and not in a courtroom. I didn't look at my wife when that thought settled in. I didn't need to. I could picture the scene without trying the kitchen table, the phone placed face down but recording the patient voice correcting a sentence, reminding a child where to pause, when to cry, how to sound scared enough to be believed. I had replayed it enough times in my head already. The judge announced a brief recess. Chairs scraped against the floor. People stood. Conversations started in hushed, confident tones. My attorney leaned toward me. "We'll have a chance," he said quietly. "Later." I nodded once. That was all. Because later was always the plan. This story didn't begin in this courtroom, and it wasn't going to end here either. What happened today was only the surface, the part everyone was allowed to see. The truth was deeper, recorded, documented, preserved in ways my wife never thought to check. I wasn't waiting to clear my name. I was waiting for the right moment to make sure my daughter never had to repeat those words again. Not in court, not anywhere. I was 56 years old when my daughter testified against me. That number matters even if it shouldn't. In court, age quietly reshapes how people see you. Too young and you're reckless. Too old and you're obsolete. I sat right in the middle, old enough to be dismissed, young enough to be suspected. I had spent most of my life working with my hands and my back before I ever learned how to sit still in rooms like that one. For 34 years, I showed up to the same industry, different buildings, different titles, but always the same expectation: be reliable. Don't complain. Solve problems quietly. I wasn't a man who chased promotions. I stayed where I was useful, where people depended on me. That habit followed me home. I believed responsibility wasn't something you talked about. It was something you demonstrated over time. You paid the mortgage on schedule. You fixed what broke. You showed up when no one else did. You didn't keep score. You didn't demand credit. I thought that was what being a husband and a father meant. I met my wife when I was already settled into my career. I wasn't charming in the way men are in movies. I didn't sell dreams. I sold stability. At the time, she said that was what she wanted. Someone steady. Someone dependable. Someone who wouldn't disappear when things got difficult. I took those words seriously. When our daughter was born, I didn't suddenly become a different man. I became a more careful one. I learned how to hold something fragile without crushing it. I learned how to listen more than I spoke. I learned that being present mattered more than being impressive. I changed diapers, I cooked dinners, I picked her up from school when my schedule allowed. On the days it didn't, I called. I never missed a birthday. I never forgot a school play, even if I stood in the back and left quietly afterward so she wouldn't feel watched. I wasn't perfect. I worked long hours. I was tired more often than I admitted. I believed providing was a form of love even when it meant being gone more than I should have been. But I was never violent. I was never unpredictable. And I was never cruel. Anger, when it came, stayed inside. I learned early that raising your voice only teaches people how to tune you out. So I didn't yell. I didn't slam doors. I didn't throw things. What I did was withdraw. I went quiet. I thought silence was safer. I didn't know then how easily silence can be rewritten by someone else. To the outside world, I probably looked unremarkable, a man who blended into his routines, a husband who let his wife speak more in social settings, a father who didn't overshare. People often mistake restraint for absence. They assume if you're not loud, you're not involved. That assumption would later become convenient. I believed in family as a structure, something you built and maintained, not something you performed. I believed loyalty was a given, not a bargaining chip. I believed children should never be asked to choose sides because that choice always costs them something they can't afford to lose. Those beliefs shaped every decision I made. They also made me predictable. Looking back, I can see how that predictability was used, how my calm was rebranded as coldness, how my distance during conflict was reframed as indifference, how my refusal to argue publicly became evidence that I had something to hide. At the time, I thought patience would protect us. I thought if I stayed steady long enough, things would settle. Families go through phases. Marriages bend. Children test boundaries. That was normal. That was survivable. What I didn't understand was that while I was holding things together quietly, someone else was building a story out loud. And stories, when repeated often enough, begin to replace reality. By the time we walked into that courtroom, I wasn't being judged against the man I actually was. I was being measured against a version of myself that had already been circulated, rehearsed, and believed. I didn't recognize that man, but everyone else seemed to. Nothing in my life was inherited. There was no family money waiting for me, no house passed down quietly, no safety net hidden behind a last name. Everything I had came from years of showing up when it would have been easier not to. The house everyone fought over later started as a modest place on the edge of town. 2 bedrooms, 1 bathroom, a roof that leaked the first winter we lived there. I remember standing in the living room with a flashlight at 3 in the morning, catching drips in a bucket while my wife slept upstairs. I didn't wake her. I didn't see the point. Some problems didn't need an audience. Over time, the house changed. I fixed the roof myself. I replaced the windows. I built the deck out back on weekends piece by piece while my daughter played in the yard. Every improvement was slow, deliberate. I kept receipts. I kept records. Not because I planned for a fight, but because I was raised to treat paperwork the way other people treated insurance. The mortgage was always in my name. So was the deed. That detail didn't seem important back then. Marriage makes you careless about ownership. You assume shared life means shared intent. You don't imagine a day when words like asset and equity will replace home. I also set up what I thought was a responsible safety measure, a family trust. Nothing elaborate, just a structure to make sure the house and savings would eventually go to my daughter without complications. I named myself trustee. My wife was listed as a beneficiary only in the event something happened to me before our daughter turned 18. It was a precaution, a boring one, the kind people skim past when they sign. I didn't highlight it, I didn't dramatize it, I filed it away with the rest of our documents, birth certificates, tax returns, insurance policies, assuming it would sit untouched for decades. Our finances followed the same pattern as everything else in my life. Conservative, predictable. I had retirement accounts I contributed to regularly, a savings account earmarked for emergencies, another one for my daughter's education. I handled the transfers. I tracked balances. I never hid anything. I believed transparency prevented suspicion. I was wrong. As my career progressed, the stability I once represented slowly became invisible. Bills were paid automatically. Repairs happened without discussion. The systems I built worked so smoothly that no one noticed the work anymore. It's easy to forget the value of something that never breaks. To my wife, the house became a given, a backdrop. To my daughter, it was simply where she grew up. To me, it was proof of consistency, of effort applied quietly over time. I never thought of it as leverage. That word came later. The first time I sensed the ground shifting was subtle, questions about accounts I'd managed for years, comments about fairness, casual mentions of friends who had protected themselves better during divorces. At the time, I attributed it to stress, to influence, to conversations I wasn't part of. I didn't lock anything down tighter. I didn't make changes. I didn't believe marriage required defensive maneuvering. That belief would cost me. When lawyers later examined my records, they didn't find gaps. They didn't find secret withdrawals or missing funds. What they found was consistency and opportunity, a structure built on trust that assumed good faith on all sides. I had built something solid. I just hadn't built it to withstand betrayal from inside. The irony was that the very order I'd maintained would eventually become the foundation for proving what was done to me. Deeds don't forget. Trust documents don't change their language to match emotions. Account histories tell the same story no matter who reads them. At the time, though, none of that felt like protection. It felt like a list of things that could be taken away. As the marriage unraveled, conversations about our future slowly transformed into negotiations about my rights. The house stopped being where memories lived and started being where value was stored. The trust stopped being a safeguard and became a complication. And my silence, my refusal to argue about money, was interpreted as guilt. I watched as the life I had built methodically was reframed as something I had controlled unfairly, as if keeping things running smoothly had been a form of manipulation. I didn't defend myself then. I still believed facts would speak when they needed to. I didn't know yet how loudly lies could be rehearsed. By the time the marriage began to fracture, I had already been recast. Not by something I said, not by anything I did openly, but by the quiet assumptions people make when a man doesn't defend himself loudly enough. To my wife, I became distant. That was the word she used. Not abusive, not neglectful, just distant. It sounded harmless, reasonable. Something a thoughtful woman might say when she was trying to explain her unhappiness without sounding cruel. What she meant was that I didn't react the way she wanted. When arguments started, I didn't escalate them. I didn't shout back. I didn't plead. I listened, nodded, and chose my words carefully. That restraint didn't calm her, it infuriated her. Silence to someone looking for control feels like resistance. To her friends, I was described differently: cold, hard to read, always working. They nodded when she said it the way people do when they already know which side they're on. No one asked how many hours I worked. No one asked why I stayed late. They filled in the gaps themselves. To them, I wasn't a man carrying responsibility. I was a man avoiding intimacy. At family gatherings, the shift became more visible. Conversations happened around me, not with me. Decisions were discussed casually, then presented to me as conclusions. If I hesitated even briefly, it was framed as stubbornness. He hates change, my wife would say with a laugh that landed too cleanly. He just doesn't like being challenged. I didn't correct her. Correcting her would have made it awkward. And I had spent a lifetime avoiding scenes. My daughter watched all of this quietly. Children always do. They learn not from what's said directly to them, but from how people treat each other when they think the child isn't paying attention. When I came home late, the story wasn't that I'd been working. It was that I'd chosen work over family. When I spent weekends fixing the house, the story wasn't that I was maintaining it. It was that I was hiding in projects. Every neutral action found a negative translation. By the time the word divorce entered the room, the narrative was already prepared. I was no longer a husband who struggled to communicate. I was a man who had emotionally checked out. A man who made people uncomfortable. A man whose silence was suspicious. Even my calm became evidence. During mediation sessions, I noticed how often people looked at me when my wife spoke about fear. Not because I was reacting aggressively, but because I wasn't reacting at all. In their minds, anger would have been easier to understand. Stillness made them uneasy. They mistook restraint for calculation. To the court-appointed counselor, I was described as reserved. To my wife's attorney, I was uncooperative. To the judge, before I ever opened my mouth, I was difficult to assess. No one ever asked why I chose not to speak freely in rooms where every word could be turned against me. And then there was my daughter. To her, at least at first, I was still her father. The man who made her breakfast when her mother slept in. The man who showed up late but always showed up. The man who didn't ask questions when she wanted quiet. But children are not immune to repetition. When someone tells you the same thing often enough, especially someone you depend on, it starts to sound like truth. Subtle comments became explanations. Explanations became warnings. Warnings became instructions. Your dad doesn't like to be questioned. He gets upset when things don't go his way. You have to be careful what you say around him. None of it sounded extreme. That was the point. By the time we stood in court, the version of me that mattered most, the one my daughter carried in her mind, had already been altered. I watched it happen from the inside, powerless to interrupt without confirming the very things I was being accused of. Any attempt to correct the story would have been labeled defensiveness. Any show of emotion would have been framed as instability. So I did what I had always done. I observed. I listened. And I remembered who was speaking for me when I stayed silent. The first time I realized something had shifted, it wasn't during an argument, it was during a dinner, a small gathering at our house. Nothing formal, no raised voices, just family plates on the table and the low hum of conversation filling the spaces between bites. Those moments used to feel safe to me, predictable, structured. That night they didn't. My wife had invited her sister and brother-in-law without mentioning it to me. That alone wasn't unusual. What was different was the way she announced it after everyone was already seated. I told them what we discussed, she said, casually passing a bowl across the table. I paused with my fork halfway to my mouth. What we discussed? She didn't look at me. About the house. Her sister smiled the kind of smile people use when they think they're being supportive. It makes sense, really, she said. You've had the place long enough. Long enough for what she didn't say. My brother-in-law nodded. Markets are good right now. If you're going to make changes, this is the time. I set my fork down slowly. We didn't agree to anything I said. The room went quiet, not tense, just alert, like they were waiting to see how I would behave. My wife sighed, not sharply, not dramatically, just enough to signal fatigue. You always do this, she said. You make everything sound like a confrontation. I looked around the table. No one met my eyes. What exactly did you tell them? I asked. She leaned back in her chair. That we're thinking about selling, downsizing, something more practical. That wasn't true. We had talked briefly about long-term planning, about retirement years away, about options, not decisions. Somewhere between our private conversation and this dinner possibility had turned into policy. I felt the familiar instinct to smooth things over, to avoid embarrassment, to keep the peace. But something in the way she spoke, confident, dismissive, made me hesitate. This isn't the time for that conversation, I said carefully. My wife laughed. Not loudly, not cruelly, just enough to make me sound unreasonable. See, she said to her sister, this is what I mean. Her sister gave me a sympathetic look that didn't feel sympathetic at all. He just doesn't like change, she said, as if explaining me to a child. I realized then that the discussion wasn't meant to include me. It was meant to define me. The rest of the dinner continued without my input. They talked about neighborhoods, about property values, about how hard it must be for my wife to manage everything on her own. I listened as my role in my own household was quietly reduced to an obstacle that needed handling. No one asked what I wanted. No one asked what I planned. When I spoke, my words landed flat, absorbed into the narrative already forming. At one point, my daughter looked at me, confusion flickering across her face. She wasn't old enough to understand the details, but she understood tone. She understood alignment. She saw who the room leaned toward. I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. I let the conversation end the way my wife wanted it to end, with consensus that didn't include me. After they left, the house felt smaller, quieter in a way that wasn't peaceful. I stood at the sink washing dishes I hadn't dirtied, listening to my wife move around behind me. She didn't thank me. She didn't mention the dinner. She acted as if the evening had gone exactly as planned. You embarrassed me, she said finally. I turned the water off. By saying we hadn't agreed to sell the house. By contradicting me, she replied. In front of people. There it was, not the lie, not the assumption. The disrespect came from my refusal to play the part silently. That's not how partnerships work, I said. She folded her arms. Partnerships require flexibility. What she meant was compliance. That night, lying in bed beside someone who no longer saw me as an equal, I understood something I hadn't allowed myself to see before. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a test. And I had failed it not by resisting, but by existing as someone whose consent still mattered. After that dinner, nothing returned to normal. Not because we argued more, but because my consent quietly stopped being required. Decisions began appearing fully formed, as if they'd been discussed somewhere I hadn't been invited. Appointments were scheduled without checking my availability. Contractors showed up to give estimates I hadn't requested. My wife started using phrases like, "We already agreed," when we hadn't spoken at all. At first, I challenged it carefully, calmly. I asked questions instead of making accusations. When did we decide this? Why wasn't I included? She never answered directly. She reframed. You're always so suspicious. You don't trust anyone. This is why communication is impossible with you. The conversation always ended with me defending my tone instead of addressing the issue. That pattern spread quickly. Our finances, which I had managed quietly for years, became a point of contention. She wanted access to accounts she'd never shown interest in before. When I hesitated, not refused, just hesitated, she accused me of hiding things. I just want transparency, she said. It was a strange word to hear used against me. When I explained how the accounts worked, where the money went, what was earmarked for what, she listened politely and then dismissed it all with a single sentence. You make everything complicated on purpose. That was new. I'd spent decades simplifying life for my family. Now that same structure was being described as control. She began involving our daughter more. Not directly at first, just casually. Comments made in passing, questions framed as concern. Does your dad ever make you uncomfortable when he's upset? You know you can tell me anything, right? They sounded like good parenting questions, protective, caring, but they were always asked after disagreements between my wife and me. Always when I'd gone quiet. Always when my daughter had seen tension, but not context. I noticed how my daughter's behavior changed around me, how she hesitated before speaking, how she watched my reactions closely, like she was waiting for something. I never gave her anything to find. Still, the distance grew. At the same time, the demands escalated. My wife suggested I move into the guest room temporarily. She said it would be easier for our daughter, less tension, a cooling off period. I agreed. That agreement would later be described as abandonment. She suggested we sell one of the cars to free up cash. I reminded her both vehicles were paid off and necessary. She accused me of being materialistic. I said nothing. She contacted a mediator without telling me, framed it as a step toward healthy separation. I found out when an email appeared in my inbox confirming an appointment I hadn't made. When I confronted her, she looked genuinely surprised that I was upset. "You said you wanted space," she said. "This is space." What she meant was distance with momentum. The pressure didn't come all at once. That would have been obvious. It came in increments small enough to justify, large enough to matter. Each concession became proof I was capable of more. Each silence became permission. And always, always the narrative ran ahead of reality. She spoke to friends about how hard it was to do everything alone. She mentioned feeling unsafe, not physically, but emotionally. That distinction mattered. It sounded responsible, measured. By the time she used the word fear, it didn't sound sudden. It sounded earned. I realized too late that escalation isn't always loud. Sometimes it's administrative, paperwork, schedules, framing. I was being repositioned from partner to problem, from father to risk, from owner to obstacle. The worst part was that none of it required lies, just emphasis, just omission, just repetition. And every time I chose calm over confrontation, the imbalance widened. I didn't see it as surrender. I saw it as patience. I thought if I held steady, the surge would pass. I didn't understand that escalation feeds on stillness. And by the time I recognized it for what it was, the ground beneath me had already shifted far enough that standing my ground would look like aggression. That was the trap. And I had walked into it quietly. I didn't recognize it as a pattern at first. Patterns only become visible when you stop hoping the next incident will be different. For a long time, I told myself each moment stood alone. A misunderstanding, a bad day, stress looking for somewhere to land. But repetition has a way of stripping excuses down to nothing. It started with language. My wife began using the same phrases in different situations like she was working from a script she'd already memorized. "You're overreacting. That's not what happened. You're remembering it wrong." At first, I challenged those statements. I corrected details. I repeated conversations word for word, not to trap her, but to ground myself. I needed to know I wasn't losing my grasp on reality. She never argued facts. She argued tone. She'd tilt her head slightly, lower her voice, and say, "Why are you getting so defensive?" I wasn't defensive. I was confused. Over time, confusion turned inward. I replayed conversations after they ended, wondering where I'd misstepped. I began second-guessing my memory, my reactions, my timing. The more carefully I spoke, the more my words were framed as calculated. That was the pattern. Any attempt to clarify became evidence of manipulation. Any silence became evidence of withdrawal. There was no position I could occupy that wasn't already labeled. Then there were the witnesses. My wife stopped confronting me privately. She saved disagreements for moments when someone else was present, her sister, a friend, even our daughter. The content of the disagreement rarely mattered. What mattered was the audience. If I corrected her in front of others, I was humiliating her. If I stayed quiet, I was confirming her version of me. I began to see how scenes were being staged. Questions were asked in a way that assumed an answer. Comments were framed as concern but landed as accusation. I noticed how often my wife would glance at others after I spoke, measuring their reactions. She wasn't listening to me anymore. She was performing around me. And slowly, so slowly, it was almost elegant, the pattern extended to our daughter. My wife didn't tell her I was dangerous. That would have been too obvious. She told her I was unpredictable, that I struggled with emotions, that I didn't handle stress well. She said these things gently, like a parent explaining weather patterns. I noticed how my daughter began asking permission to do things she'd never hesitated over before. How she flinched at raised voices on television, how she studied my face when I walked into a room checking for something she couldn't name. I adjusted myself constantly. I softened my voice. I slowed my movements. I chose my words with surgical care. It didn't help. Because the pattern didn't rely on my behavior. It relied on interpretation. One night, I overheard my wife on the phone in the kitchen. She didn't know I was home. I stood in the hallway listening to my name being reshaped into something I barely recognized. "I'm just trying to keep things calm," she said. "You know how he gets." There it was again. Not what I did, how I got. That phrase traveled easily. It required no evidence. It invited imagination to fill in the gaps. The next day, my daughter asked me if I was mad at her. I wasn't. But the fact that she needed to ask told me everything. That was the moment I stopped seeing incidents and started seeing structure. Each accusation followed the same arc. Each resolution required my compliance. Each retelling placed me further from the center of my own life. I wasn't being argued with. I was being repositioned. From husband to liability. From father to potential threat. From participant to subject. The most disturbing part was how reasonable it all sounded when spoken aloud. No screaming, no dramatic claims, just concern repeated often enough to harden into belief. I understood then why I felt like I was constantly arriving late to my own conversations. Decisions weren't being made impulsively. They were being layered one on top of another until resistance looked irrational. That realization didn't bring relief. It brought clarity. And clarity, once it arrives, doesn't let you pretend anymore. I knew then that this wasn't going to resolve itself. Patterns don't dissolve on their own. They escalate, especially when they're working. And it was working. The court documents hadn't appeared yet. The accusations hadn't been formalized, but the groundwork was already laid. The language had been chosen, the roles assigned. All that remained was the right setting. And when that setting arrived, it would feel inevitable to everyone except me. The warning signs didn't arrive as threats. They arrived as paperwork. An envelope appeared on the kitchen counter one afternoon addressed to both of us. Inside were copies of bank statements I hadn't printed. The pages were neatly stacked corners aligned like evidence prepared for review. "I just wanted to understand things better," my wife said when I asked about them. Her tone was calm, almost apologetic. There was nothing wrong with the statements themselves. Every transaction was legitimate. Every balance made sense. What unsettled me was the fact that she'd requested them without telling me, and the way she watched my face as I flipped through the pages. She wasn't looking for information. She was watching for reaction. A week later, she asked me to sign a document. Nothing dramatic, just an authorization form, she said, so she could handle things if I was unavailable. I read it twice. It granted temporary financial authority well beyond what we'd discussed. I handed it back without signing. "I'm not comfortable with this," I said. She didn't argue. She smiled thinly. "Of course," she said. "I figured you might feel that way." That was it. No pushback. No discussion. The form disappeared. 2 days later, she told her sister I refused to let her access our finances because I didn't trust her. That was the first time I realized how quickly refusal became accusation. The messages started after that. Not from her, from others. Friends checking in. Family members asking vague questions. "Are you okay?" Things must be stressful right now. No one mentioned what they'd heard, but I could feel it circling. My wife began documenting things. I noticed a notebook on her nightstand always closed when I walked by. She started typing on her phone when we spoke, her thumbs moving even when she wasn't texting anyone. She asked questions and waited eyes down, recording something that never reflected what I actually said. Once I asked her directly, "Are you writing things down?" She looked up, surprised. "Why? That makes you uncomfortable." I didn't answer. The next warning sign came from our daughter's school. A counselor called to suggest a meeting. "Routine," she said. "Just to check in." My wife insisted on attending alone. "She'll feel safer opening up if it's just me," she said. I didn't argue. After the meeting, my daughter wouldn't meet my eyes. She hugged me stiffly. That night she asked if I was going to leave. I told her no. She didn't look convinced. The final sign came quietly buried in an email thread I almost missed. My wife had contacted a family law office weeks earlier, not to file anything, just to explore options. The language was careful, non-committal, but the timestamp told me everything. She had been preparing long before I understood there was something to prepare for. I sat at my desk that night scrolling through old messages, old documents, old versions of conversations I thought were settled. Patterns sharpened into lines, lines into shape. This wasn't chaos, it was structure. Every request had a purpose. Every refusal of mine had been logged somewhere mentally, if not in writing. Every calm response had been reinterpreted as avoidance. Every boundary had been reframed as control. I wasn't being pushed, I was being documented. And documentation only matters when it's meant to be used. That was when I stopped assuming things would correct themselves, when I stopped believing that reason would interrupt momentum. I didn't confront her. I didn't warn her that I was paying attention now. I did what I had always done best. I observed. I saved copies. I stopped speaking unless necessary. Because the moment you realize warning signs are no longer warnings, but preparation, you understand something else too. What's coming doesn't need to be announced. It's already in motion. The line wasn't crossed in a moment of rage. There was no screaming, no shattered objects, no threat that could be pointed to later and labeled unmistakably violent. What happened was quieter than that and far more deliberate. It began with a knock at the door. I had come home early that afternoon. The house was quiet, the kind of quiet that usually meant my wife had taken our daughter out. I was standing in the hallway when the knock came again, firm, official, practiced. When I opened the door, 2 police officers stood on the porch. They were polite, calm, apologetic even. "We received a call," one of them said. "We just need to ask a few questions." My wife appeared behind me almost immediately. She didn't look surprised. She looked prepared. She wrapped her arms around herself and stepped slightly away from me, positioning her body so the officers could see her clearly. I noticed with a strange sense of detachment that she had changed clothes since that morning. Softer fabric, long sleeves. "I didn't want it to come to this," she said quietly. I turned to her. "What is this?" She didn't answer me. She addressed the officers instead. "He's been under a lot of stress," she said. "I'm worried about our daughter." That was all it took. The questions were careful, structured, designed to elicit concern rather than facts. Had there been arguments? Had voices been raised? Did I ever lose my temper? I answered truthfully, calmly. "Yes, we've argued. No, I've never hurt anyone. I don't raise my voice." They wrote things down anyway. Then my wife said the sentence she'd been building toward for months. "He grabbed our daughter last night." The words didn't register at first. I looked at her, waiting for the rest of the sentence. A correction. A clarification. Something that would anchor it to reality. Nothing came. The officer's posture changed. Not aggressively, just decisively. One of them stepped slightly between us. "Sir," he said, "we need you to step outside." I didn't argue. I didn't protest. I didn't ask to see my daughter. I knew better. Outside, one of the officers explained that there would be a temporary separation for everyone's safety. I was told to gather a few personal items. I was told I could retrieve the rest later. I was told not to return without permission. Inside, my wife was crying now, softly. Her shoulders shook. Our daughter stood behind her, eyes wide, confused, silent. I didn't move toward her. I knew that any movement would be interpreted as threat. So I stood there while the life I had built closed its door on me. I packed a bag in silence. Clothes, a charger, my wallet. Nothing sentimental. Nothing that could be used later to suggest emotional instability. When I reached the front door, my wife finally looked at me. "You scared her," she said. I wanted to say her name. I wanted to ask what exactly I had done. I wanted to explain that the only time I'd touched our daughter the night before was to guide her away from the stove. But the room wasn't listening anymore. I left. The next day, a temporary restraining order arrived by email. It was clinical, efficient. It outlined boundaries I was not to cross, locations I was not to enter, people I was not to contact, including my daughter. The affidavit attached to it read like fiction written by someone who knew my habits but not my character. Phrases I recognized, descriptions I almost believed until I remembered they weren't mine. Anger issues, intimidation, fear, no bruises, no witnesses, just statements. That was the moment something in me went cold. Not angry, not panicked, clear. This wasn't escalation anymore, this was erasure. I understood then that the line wasn't crossed when the police showed up. It was crossed long before that when my wife decided my role as a father could be rewritten without my consent. Everything after was procedure. And procedures once started don't reverse themselves out of sympathy. I didn't call her, I didn't text, I didn't beg to see my child. I knew now that every word would be recorded, reframed, and reused. So I disappeared exactly the way they said I always had, and I began preparing for the only response that would still be allowed to me. Silence with memory. Silence doesn't arrive all at once. It settles in layers like dust in an abandoned room. At first, you don't notice it. You're too busy reacting, finding a place to sleep, answering emails from work, reading the same legal paragraph over and over until the words stop changing. I stayed in a small rental on the edge of town, furnished, neutral. The kind of place meant for people who aren't staying long. The walls were bare. The air smelled faintly of cleaning solution and old carpet. It suited the situation. The first night I sat on the edge of the bed, fully dressed, listening to the building settle around me. No footsteps upstairs. No television murmuring through the walls. No child breathing in the next room. I didn't cry. I didn't pace. I opened my laptop and reread the restraining order until I knew every clause by heart. Distances. Durations. Conditions. What counted as contact. What counted as violation. Silence. I learned has rules. I followed them exactly. I didn't call my wife. I didn't email her. I didn't ask for updates about my daughter. Every instinct told me to reach out, to explain, to reassure, to remind her who I was. I ignored every one of those instincts, because explanation implies guilt, and reassurance in the wrong context can sound like pressure. At work, I told people I was dealing with a family matter. No details. No excuses. I arrived on time. I left on time. I did my job as if nothing had changed. That was harder than it sounds. Every quiet moment pulled my thoughts back to the same image, my daughter standing in the doorway, watching me leave without saying goodbye. The look on her face, not fear, not anger, but confusion that had nowhere to go. I replayed that look in my mind until it lost sharpness, until it became something I could carry without breaking. Days passed, then weeks. The silence grew heavier. I heard through third parties that my wife was holding up, that she was doing what she had to do for the child, that things were calmer now, calmer because I was gone. I received official notices. Mediation dates, temporary custody arrangements, all written in language that assumed facts had already been established. I responded only when required, through proper channels, with minimal language. I let my attorney speak when speech was necessary. Privately, I began organizing, not plotting, not reacting. Organizing. I pulled old files from storage, tax returns, account statements, trust documents, email backups, phone records. I made copies, then copies of the copies. I labeled everything with dates and times. I didn't know yet what I would need. I only knew I would need something. The silence wasn't empty. It was observant. I noticed how quickly narratives solidify when they're not challenged, how absence becomes interpretation, how restraint is mistaken for resignation. People stopped asking questions. They had their answers already. I learned to sit with that. At night, I wrote nothing. No journal, no emotional record, nothing that could be read later and reframed. I kept my thoughts where they belonged in my head, where they couldn't be edited. The only time I broke silence was with my attorney. He listened. He asked precise questions. He didn't offer comfort. He offered structure. That was enough. He told me what to expect next. Hearings, evaluations, statements taken as truth until proven otherwise. Family court moves slowly, he said. But once something is on record, it's hard to remove. I nodded. I wasn't in a hurry anymore. Silence had changed me, not into something weaker, but into something narrower, more focused, less reactive. I no longer wondered if things would go back to how they were. I understood now that the past was irrelevant. What mattered was what could be proven, and what could be endured without visible damage. I stayed silent not because I had nothing to say, but because the moment I spoke again, I wanted the room to be forced to listen. Withdrawal isn't dramatic. It doesn't look like defeat, and it doesn't feel like peace. It's the deliberate act of removing yourself from a space that no longer allows you to exist honestly. After the restraining order, my world narrowed to what was permitted. Streets I could drive, buildings I could enter, conversations I could have without creating a record that might later be read aloud by someone who didn't know me. I stopped reaching outward. I didn't ask mutual friends how my wife was doing. I didn't ask anyone about my daughter. Curiosity, I learned, is dangerous when it can be framed as obsession. Instead, I watched from a distance. Social media showed me what words wouldn't. Photos posted carefully, smiles arranged just right, captions about new beginnings and doing what's best. I wasn't tagged. I wasn't mentioned. It was as if I had already been written out of the story. That erasure did something to me. Not emotionally, practically. It stripped away the illusion that my presence mattered in the way I thought it had. The system didn't need me to participate anymore. It needed me to comply. So I complied completely. I changed my routines, new grocery stores, new routes to work. I avoided places my daughter used to love, not because I was told to, but because coincidence can be reinterpreted. I became careful to the point of invisibility. That invisibility gave me time to notice details I'd ignored before, time to replay moments not for pain but for pattern. I remembered things my wife had said in passing comments that hadn't landed then, but now felt weighted. I remembered how often she'd insisted on being the one to speak for our family, how frequently she summarized conversations instead of letting them happen, how she'd corrected my tone in front of others while claiming to protect harmony. Distance clarified those memories. Without constant interaction, I could see the shape of what had been built around me. How isolation hadn't been a consequence, it had been a goal. The more removed I became, the more stable her narrative grew. That was fine. I didn't need to interrupt it yet. Withdrawal also meant restraint with information. I stopped volunteering explanations. When professionals asked questions, I answered precisely. No elaboration, no emotional coloring, facts only. It frustrated people. They expected defensiveness, emotion, something to latch onto. My refusal to perform left them with nothing to interpret. At night, I sat at my desk and reviewed timelines, not obsessively, methodically. I created a clean sequence of events, what happened when it happened, who was present, what could be verified. I didn't assign motive. I let the facts speak in their own neutral language. From a distance, I noticed something else. The noise around me faded, but the noise around her increased. More posts, more explanations, more careful signaling of victimhood and resilience. People who are secure rarely need to convince an audience. I took that observation and stored it away. Withdrawal changed my posture in the world. I stopped trying to be understood by everyone. I focused on being understood by one system that still respected evidence: the law. It wasn't comforting, it wasn't fast, but it was structured, and structure was something I knew how to work with. By removing myself from the emotional battlefield, I gave the conflict room to reveal its own inconsistencies. I let time do what confrontation never could. I didn't disappear because I had nothing left. I withdrew because stepping back was the only way to see the entire field. The first real clue didn't come from my wife. It came from my daughter. Not directly, not intentionally. It slipped out the way truths often do, quietly, without understanding the weight they carry. It happened during a supervised call, court-approved, time-limited, a neutral presence listening in. My daughter's voice came through the speaker, thinner than I remembered, carefully measured, like she was walking on a narrow bridge and didn't trust the ground beneath her. We talked about school, about a book she was reading, about a science project she hadn't finished yet. Normal things, safe things. I didn't ask about her mother. I didn't ask about court. I didn't ask how she felt. Those questions weren't allowed, even if no one had said so explicitly. Toward the end of the call, she hesitated. "Dad," she said. "Yes." There was a pause. I heard paper moving, the soft sound of something being straightened. "Mom says I have to tell the truth," she said. I waited. "And I am," she added quickly, too quickly. "I know," I said. Another pause, longer this time. She helped me remember things. My daughter continued, because sometimes I forget what happened. My hand tightened around the edge of the desk. "How did she help?" I asked, keeping my voice level. "She tells me what to say," my daughter said. Then, as if correcting herself, she reminds me. That was it. The monitor cleared her throat softly on the other end of the line. A signal to steer the conversation away. I didn't press. But the moment lodged itself in my mind with surgical precision. That night, I replayed the sentence over and over. She tells me what to say. Not suggests. Not ask questions. Tells. I went back through everything I'd been collecting. Emails, statements, affidavits. Every document describing my wife as careful, supportive, concerned about emotional safety. None of them mentioned preparation. None of them mentioned repetition. But I started to notice something else. Language. The phrasing in my wife's filings echoed itself too perfectly. Certain sentences appeared almost verbatim across different documents written weeks apart, supposedly describing separate incidents. The same metaphors, the same emotional descriptors, the same progression of fear. It wasn't just consistent, it was rehearsed. I compared those phrases to what my daughter had said on the witness stand during the preliminary hearing. The match wasn't exact, but the rhythm was. Adult language softened just enough to sound like a child. That was the first crack. I didn't tell my attorney right away. I wanted more than intuition, more than implication. I requested transcripts from every hearing. I reviewed recordings of supervised calls. I listened not for meaning, but for structure. Where sentences began, where they paused, how emotions were introduced. Then I remembered something small, something I'd almost dismissed months earlier. My wife used to practice conversations out loud, not arguments presentations. She would stand in the kitchen, phone in hand, repeating the same sentence again and again, adjusting emphasis, smoothing phrasing. I'd assumed it was work-related. Now I wasn't so sure. I dug deeper. I recovered an old backup from my phone audio files I hadn't touched in years. Voicemails, memos, accidental recordings triggered by a faulty app I'd once meant to delete. Most were nothing. Then I found one that made me sit perfectly still. It was short, less than 2 minutes, recorded late at night months before the police ever showed up. My wife's voice was calm, focused. "Say it exactly like this," she said. There was a pause. No slower. "You need to sound scared, not angry." Another pause. Again. I didn't hear my daughter's voice clearly, just the faint shape of it, repeating, trying. My chest tightened, not with rage, but with something colder. Recognition. This wasn't improvisation, this was training. The clue wasn't circumstantial anymore, it was structural. Someone had turned my child into a script, and scripts leave patterns. I backed the file up 3 times. I documented its origin. I logged the timestamp. I didn't tell anyone yet, not even my attorney. I wasn't ready to reveal it, because the first clue doesn't end the story. It tells you where to look next. Once you find the first thread, everything else starts pulling tighter. I went back to the audio file again, not to listen for emotion, but for structure. The pauses. The corrections. The way my wife adjusted tone, the way a director adjusts lighting. This wasn't anger. It was precision. I began laying timelines side by side. On one side, my wife's statements, emails to her attorney, notes from counselors' affidavits filed with the court. On the other, transcripts from hearings, supervised calls, summaries, and the exact phrases my daughter had used. Patterns emerged immediately. Certain words appeared in clusters. Unsafe, intimidated, scared to speak. These weren't words my daughter had ever used naturally. She had always described feelings with images, not labels. My stomach feels tight. I don't like it when voices get loud. Child language. Now the language had grown up overnight. I charted the overlap, color-coded it. Dates aligned too cleanly to be coincidence. Each escalation in my wife's filings was followed days later by my daughter echoing a softened version of the same idea during calls or testimony. Not memory. Transmission. I asked my attorney for discovery logs, not to accuse, just to observe. The logs showed frequent short meetings between my wife and the court-appointed counselor in the weeks before each major hearing, always private, always undocumented beyond a brief summary. I requested the summaries. They read like bullet points from a briefing. Emotional themes highlighted, key concerns to address, language to avoid. Focus areas. Focus areas. The word stuck with me. I compared those summaries to the way my daughter hesitated before certain answers, how she paused, corrected herself, then landed on phrasing that felt pre-approved, the same cadence, the same safe endings. I didn't confront anyone. I connected. Then I remembered something else. Months before the separation, my wife had insisted on buying a small camera for the living room. She said it was for security. Peace of mind. I hadn't objected. I barely noticed it after installation. I checked the footage archive. Most of it was innocuous, empty rooms, routine movements, nothing incriminating unless you knew what to look for. Late-night recordings showed my wife sitting at the kitchen table with papers spread out. Sometimes she spoke softly toward the hallway. Sometimes she paused, waited, then repeated herself more slowly. I zoomed in on the audio waveform. There it was again. Say it exactly like this. Different night, same phrasing. I synced the timestamps with my daughter's school calendar. On nights when my daughter had early counseling sessions the next day, the rehearsals ran longer. More repetition, more correction. This wasn't improvisation reacting to stress. This was preparation responding to schedule. The final connection came unexpectedly from my wife's own confidence. In one of her filings, she referenced a specific incident she claimed happened on a date I knew I wasn't home. I checked my work logs. Badge access confirmed it. I pulled the living room footage from that night. The camera showed an empty room. No confrontation, no raised voices. Just silence. I cross-referenced the claim with my daughter's testimony. She described the same incident but shifted it by one day. That detail mattered. It meant the story had been revised after the fact, and revisions leave seams. I compiled everything into a single neutral report. No commentary, no accusations. Just alignment what was said when it was said and how it evolved. The connections were undeniable. Someone had been shaping the narrative step by step, teaching a child not what happened, but how to say it convincingly. I finally showed my attorney the audio. He didn't react the way I expected. No outrage. No shock. He leaned back in his chair and nodded once. This, he said, changes the posture of the case. That was all. We didn't rush to file anything. We didn't confront my wife with the evidence. We didn't ask the court for emergency relief. We waited. Because when a story is built on rehearsal, the worst thing you can do is interrupt the performance too early. You let it continue until the contradictions speak louder than the script. Confirmation didn't arrive as a single revelation. It arrived as convergence. Separate pieces, each defensible on its own, collapsed into a single, unavoidable conclusion once placed side by side. The difference between suspicion and certainty isn't volume. It's alignment. My attorney and I met late one evening long after office hours. No assistants, no phones on the table, just documents spread in deliberate order, each one earning its place. We started with the audio. Not the full recording, just a short segment. Clear enough to understand. Clean enough to authenticate. The phrase repeated again, unmistakable in cadence and intent. Say it exactly like this. Then we moved to timelines. Counseling sessions. Supervised calls. Hearing dates. Each rehearsal preceded a public statement. Each correction matched a later testimony shift. The pattern was too consistent to be accidental. Next came the footage. The living room camera clips were unremarkable unless you knew what you were listening for. We isolated the audio, enhanced it carefully, and documented chain of custody. The dates matched the counselor's summaries. The content matched the child's phrasing weeks later. This wasn't coaching inferred from behavior. This was instruction captured in real time. My attorney didn't interrupt. He didn't react. He watched listened, marked timestamps, and nodded only when something passed a legal threshold. When we finished, he leaned forward and folded his hands. This isn't just parental influence, he said. This is fabrication. The word landed heavily, but it didn't shock me. It fit. We prepared a motion not to accuse, but to request a forensic review. Neutral language, conservative framing. We asked the court to appoint an independent evaluator and to review the evidence under seal. No drama, no press, no grandstanding. The confirmation came in the evaluator's report. Children who recall lived experiences don't repeat language with this level of precision across contexts. They don't maintain emotional timing with adult consistency. They don't pause at identical points unless taught where to pause. The report cited developmental markers, linguistic patterns, memory formation indicators. It concluded carefully that the testimony showed signs of rehearsal inconsistent with spontaneous recall. That sentence mattered. It meant the issue was no longer my word against my wife's. It was methodology against manipulation. The court ordered a limited evidentiary hearing. My wife appeared confident, relaxed. She had no reason not to be. Up until that moment, everything had worked. The narrative was intact. The system had accepted it. During questioning, she spoke calmly about protecting her child, about encouraging honesty, about never telling our daughter what to say. Then the audio was introduced. Not played immediately. Identified first. Authenticated. Time-stamped. Sourced. Her attorney objected procedurally, predictably. The objection was overruled. The recording played. Not the entire file. Just enough. Say it exactly like this. No slower. Again. The room changed. My wife didn't cry. She didn't look at me. She stared straight ahead, jaw tight, calculating. When questioned, she claimed the recording was taken out of context, that she was helping our daughter express feelings, that she never intended to manipulate. The evaluator's report contradicted her. So did the camera footage. So did the timeline. Confirmation isn't about humiliation. It's about collapse. Her story didn't fall apart all at once. It sagged under its own weight until it couldn't stand without explanation. And explanations only multiplied the contradictions. The judge ordered the child's testimony struck from the record. That sentence mattered more than any verdict could have. Because once the testimony was removed, the case returned to evidence. And evidence finally favored truth over performance. I didn't feel triumph. I felt gravity. There's no satisfaction in proving your child was used, only relief that the use has been exposed. The confirmation closed one door and opened another. Now that manipulation had been established, the court needed to decide what to do with that knowledge. Custody, supervision, accountability. We weren't finished, but we were no longer guessing. The line between doubt and certainty had been crossed not by emotion, but by proof. And from that point forward, every step would be governed by what could be demonstrated, not what could be claimed. Once confirmation settles in, hesitation becomes indulgence. I didn't feel anger when the judge struck my daughter's testimony from the record. I felt responsibility. Proof changes what you're allowed to do next. It removes the excuse of uncertainty and replaces it with obligation. My attorney laid out the options carefully. We could push immediately, file motions, seek sanctions, demand emergency custody changes. The evidence justified it. The court would listen now. But listening isn't the same as understanding. Family court punishes impatience more often than it rewards truth. I had waited this long. I could wait longer if waiting meant the difference between a temporary correction and a permanent outcome. So we made a decision that surprised everyone but my attorney. We wouldn't confront my wife directly. We wouldn't leak the evidence. We wouldn't rush the court. We would let the system do what it does best when properly fed document schedule and compel. The decision was simple in principle and difficult in execution. We would pursue resolution through law alone, cleanly, methodically, without emotional escalation. Every move would be predictable, every filing precise, every step recorded, no surprises. That restraint wasn't mercy, it was strategy. I knew my wife. I knew how she operated when she believed she was winning. Confidence made her careless. Carelessness creates records. Records create leverage. So we shifted posture. My attorney requested expanded discovery. Subpoenas were prepared for counseling notes, communication logs, device backups. Neutral phrasing, routine requests. Nothing that looked like an accusation. At the same time, we petitioned for a revised custody evaluation, not on grounds of misconduct, but concern for the child's emotional integrity. That language mattered. It reframed the issue from blame to protection. Protection is the one argument the court never ignores. I agreed to additional monitoring, additional evaluations, additional oversight. Every condition my wife had once demanded for me, I accepted voluntarily. That too mattered. It created contrast. I didn't speak publicly. I didn't post. I didn't hint. I didn't let anyone know what we were building. Silence became my shield again, but this time it was reinforced with evidence. Privately, I prepared for what came next. I organized files into court-ready exhibits. I labeled everything according to evidentiary standards. I rehearsed nothing. Rehearsal was the problem we were exposing. I waited. Waiting doesn't feel passive when it's purposeful. It feels tense, heavy. Like standing behind a closed door listening to footsteps approach without knowing how loud the knock will be. The decision locked us into a path that couldn't be rushed or reversed. Once chosen, it required discipline. No shortcuts, no emotional detours. I was ready for that. Because this wasn't about winning an argument. It was about removing a lie so completely that it could never be reconstructed. The law, when allowed to work without interference, does one thing well. It preserves what's real and exposes what's manufactured. I had chosen my arena, and I would stay inside its rules until the truth didn't need my voice to be heard. I didn't choose my attorney because he was aggressive. I chose him because he was methodical. In family court, aggression reads as instability. Structure reads as credibility. He understood that difference instinctively the way some people understand weather patterns, by watching pressure shift long before the storm arrives. Our first real strategy meeting wasn't emotional. It was architectural. He drew lines on a legal pad, dividing the page into sections: evidence, procedure, timing, risk, outcome. Each category stayed in its place. Nothing overlapped unless it had to. "We're not here to tell a story," he said. "We're here to correct the record." That sentence became our foundation. He explained how the court would move now that manipulation had been established. Slowly, carefully. Reluctant to admit error, but obligated to respond to proof. Judges don't like being shown how they were misled. They prefer being given a way to realign without embarrassment. That meant structure mattered more than speed. We mapped the legal framework piece by piece. First, custody posture. Not a demand for immediate reversal, but a request for stabilization, temporary adjustments justified by the evaluator's findings. Supervised contact modified, authority redistributed. Language chosen to suggest concern, not punishment. Second, evidentiary integrity. Every file had to be unimpeachable, chain of custody documented, originals preserved, copies certified, metadata verified. Nothing could feel improvised. Third, procedural patience. My attorney scheduled filings to coincide with existing court dates, not to create urgency, but to appear cooperative. Judges reward litigants who respect the court's calendar. Fourth, containment. We limited what was disclosed and when. Evidence would be introduced only when necessary, only in response to specific claims. No information dumps. No theatrics. He warned me about something I hadn't considered. Once we expose the manipulation fully, he said, the court will shift focus from your wife to the child's welfare. That means scrutiny for everyone, including you. I nodded. I was ready for scrutiny. We prepared for it. I agreed to parenting evaluations, psychological screenings, home inspections. Any condition that demonstrated transparency I accepted without negotiation. The contrast mattered. Where my wife had resisted oversight, I invited it. That wasn't altruism. It was structure. My attorney drafted a timeline that read like a ledger. No adjectives, no speculation, just dates, actions, consequences. Each entry supported by a document, a recording, or a third-party report. When I read it, I didn't recognize my own life in it. It was cleaner than memory. That he explained was the point. Courts don't rule on feelings, they rule on patterns, and patterns require clarity. We also addressed assets, not because money was central, but because control often hides there. The house deed, the trust documents, account authorizations. Everything that had once been peripheral was now potential leverage. He reviewed the trust structure carefully and smiled. "You did this years ago," he asked. I nodded. "It's conservative," he said, and inconvenient for someone trying to move quickly. That mattered. It meant my wife's ability to manipulate assets had limits. It meant sudden changes would require explanation. Explanation invites scrutiny. Structure again. We planned for retaliation. Because exposure rarely ends behavior, it redirects it. My attorney prepared responses to predictable claims that I was controlling, that I was retaliating, that the evidence was taken out of context. Each response was drafted before the accusation could be made. Preparation isn't paranoia. It's anticipation grounded in pattern. As we built the framework, something shifted inside me. For the first time since the police knock, I wasn't reacting. I wasn't defending. I wasn't absorbing someone else's narrative and trying to survive it. I was participating quietly, precisely in dismantling it. The law became less abstract and more mechanical. Inputs produced outputs. Evidence produced consequence. The system wasn't compassionate, but it was consistent when engaged correctly. That consistency was enough. My attorney closed the folder and looked at me. "This will take time," he said, "and it won't feel fair at every step." I understood. Fairness is emotional. Justice is procedural. I had chosen procedure. We stood up, shook hands. No dramatic words, no promises, just structure locked in place, ready to bear weight. The trap didn't look like a trap. That was the point. It looked like cooperation. After confirmation, my wife expected confrontation, accusations, emergency motions, some visible attempt to reclaim ground. When none of that came, she relaxed. I could feel it in the rhythm of her filings, shorter, less guarded, confident, in a way that only comes when someone believes the worst is over. We encouraged that belief. My attorney filed nothing aggressive. We agreed to routine scheduling. We responded to requests promptly. Every communication was polite, restrained, professional. No hints of strategy. No suggestion that the ground beneath her narrative had already cracked. At the same time, the structure we'd built began to close around her quietly. Discovery expanded not abruptly but naturally. We requested device backups under standard disclosure rules. Phone logs, cloud storage, messaging apps. The requests were framed as mutual obligations. Nothing targeted, nothing accusatory. She complied partially. That partial compliance mattered more than full refusal ever could. Gaps appeared. Missing date ranges. Incomplete exports. Files labeled as unavailable. Each omission required explanation. Each explanation created a record. We didn't challenge those explanations immediately. We logged them. The court-appointed evaluator requested follow-up interviews. My wife agreed confident she could manage them. She had always managed conversations well. This was familiar territory. What she didn't account for was fatigue. Rehearsed narratives require maintenance. Consistency demands attention. Over time, even the most careful stories begin to slip, not in substance, but in sequence. Dates blurred. Details shifted. She corrected herself mid-sentence, then offered a revised version without noticing the change. The evaluator noticed. So did we. Meanwhile, my attorney requested a narrow technical review of the original audio recording, not to challenge its authenticity, but to establish context. The review confirmed continuous capture. No edits, no splicing, no manipulation. That neutral confirmation stripped away the last plausible defense. Still, we waited. Waiting wasn't passive. It was calibrated. Every new filing from my wife revealed a little more. She began over-explaining, adding qualifiers, preemptively defending points that hadn't been challenged yet. That's when you know the trap is working. People who feel secure don't explain. People who sense instability try to stabilize the narrative by force. We allowed her to. Then came the scheduling order. The court set a full evidentiary hearing, not emergency, not expedited. Standard procedure. Enough time for preparation. Enough time for confidence to grow. Enough time for mistakes. My attorney advised against introducing the strongest evidence first. Courts expect escalation. They're skeptical of early knockout blows. So we planned sequence. First, inconsistencies. Second, omissions. Third, contradictions between her statements and independent records. Only then the recordings. Only then the evaluator's conclusions. The trap wasn't about catching her in a lie. It was about letting her demonstrate a pattern. By the time the hearing approached, my wife had submitted supplemental statements meant to clarify earlier testimony. Each clarification subtly altered prior claims. She didn't realize those alterations were being tracked line by line. On the surface, nothing dramatic had happened. Privately, everything had shifted. The narrative she'd built was now too large to control. It required constant reinforcement, constant vigilance, constant rewriting. Ours didn't. We weren't managing a story, we were documenting behavior. The final step was restraint. My attorney reminded me not to react during the hearing. No visible emotion, no interruptions, no visible satisfaction when contradictions surfaced. The court needs to see contrast, he said, not performance. I understood. For months, my wife had directed every scene, every angle, every line. The courtroom had been her stage. Now we were changing the lighting and letting her continue to act as if nothing had changed. Waiting is a discipline. It's not the absence of action, it's the refusal to move too early. After the trap was set, everything slowed down on the surface. No urgent filings, no late-night emails, no visible tension. Just dates on a calendar and silence in between. That silence wasn't empty. It pressed in. Every morning I checked nothing. No inbox refreshes, no court portals. I kept my routines, fixed work, meals, sleep. Predictability became armor. The more ordinary my days looked, the harder it was for anyone to argue that I was unraveling. The waiting tested restraint more than anger ever could. I knew what was coming. I knew the evidence would land. I knew the contradictions would surface. But knowing isn't the same as enduring the gap between cause and consequence. My attorney cautioned me against anticipation. Don't rehearse outcomes, he said. Rehearsal belongs to the other side. So I didn't imagine victory. I didn't imagine vindication. I imagined procedure. Steps taken in order, questions asked in sequence, evidence introduced when invited. That mental framing kept me steady. Across the aisle, my wife grew louder. Not publicly, subtly. Supplemental statements. Clarifying emails. Messages to mutual acquaintances framed as concern for stability and closure. Each one attempted to close doors that hadn't been opened yet. That urgency told me everything. People who are secure don't rush closure. The court's silence amplified that imbalance. Dates were set weeks apart. Motions sat pending. The evaluator's schedule stretched. Each delay created space where narratives either hold or fray. I waited inside that space. On nights when sleep came late, I reviewed the evidence not to relive it, but to confirm its order. Order matters when emotions threaten to intrude. I reminded myself that this wasn't about punishing my wife. It was about protecting my daughter from a system that had mistaken performance for truth. That reminder mattered. It kept my posture neutral when we crossed paths in hallways. No eye contact, no reaction, just presence without engagement. The absence of response unsettles people more than confrontation. The waiting also revealed something else, how quickly allies shift when momentum stalls. People who had once repeated my wife's concerns began asking quieter questions. Not to me, to each other. What's taking so long? Why hasn't the court ruled yet? Those questions weren't accusations. They were fractures. I didn't exploit them. Fractures widen on their own. As the hearing approached, my attorney reviewed logistics. Exhibit order. Witness sequence. Time limits. Everything precise, nothing theatrical. The calm before a storm is often misnamed. It's not calm, it's alignment. On the final night before the hearing, I didn't prepare a statement. I prepared nothing. There was nothing left to add. I slept. In the morning, I dressed simply. No tie chosen for effect. No accessories meant to signal virtue. I carried only what was required: identification documents and silence. At the courthouse steps, I felt the familiar weight return, the kind that settles when something irreversible is about to happen. Not fear, not hope. Gravity. The waiting had done its work. It had stripped away urgency, ego, and impulse. What remained was readiness, not to speak, but to let the record speak without interruption. When the doors opened, I walked in knowing that whatever happened next would not be improvised. It would be revealed. Confidence changes people. It loosens them. It makes them speak longer than necessary, explain things that don't need explanation, smile, when silence would be safer. When someone believes the worst has passed, they stop guarding the edges of their story. My wife arrived at the courthouse that morning with that kind of confidence. She wore the same calm expression she'd perfected months earlier, the one that suggested endurance, not calculation. She greeted her attorney with familiarity, leaned in to whisper something that made him nod, then took her seat without looking in my direction. She didn't need to. From her perspective, everything that mattered had already happened. The child's testimony had carried weight before. The restraining order still existed. The public narrative, quietly reinforced, remained intact. The delays felt like bureaucracy, not danger. People mistake delay for weakness. I stayed still. Hands folded, eyes forward, no acknowledgement. Across the aisle, I could feel her certainty growing. She adjusted papers, straightened her posture, glanced once toward the gallery, as if to confirm who was watching. She thought this hearing was procedural cleanup, a formality. Her attorney opened with a measured summary, careful to frame the case as settled ground. He spoke about consistency, about stability, about the importance of not disrupting a child's environment once fear had been established. Established. That word carried weight until it didn't. When my attorney stood, he didn't counter the narrative immediately. He thanked the court. He acknowledged the complexity of family dynamics. He emphasized cooperation. That emphasis confused her. I saw it in the way she tilted her head slightly, listening for the angle she couldn't find. Then the questions began, not accusatory, not dramatic. Clarifying questions, dates, sequences, requests for specificity. My wife answered smoothly at first, yes. No, I don't recall exactly, but the details started slipping. A date off by a week, an incident described in reverse order, a correction made casually as if it didn't matter. It mattered. My attorney didn't pounce. He let the answers settle. He repeated them back, asked her to confirm. He asked whether she'd mentioned the same details in prior filings. She said yes. He produced the filing. The wording didn't match. Her confidence didn't vanish. It narrowed. She leaned forward now. Her answers grew longer, explanations more careful. She began anticipating questions that hadn't been asked yet. That's when people reveal what they're protecting. The evaluator testified next. Neutral, clinical, precise. They described patterns in language acquisition, rehearsal indicators, the difference between spontaneous recall and coached response. They cited examples without emotion, without emphasis. The court listened. My wife didn't. She shifted in her seat, crossed and uncrossed her legs, took notes she never looked at again. Her attorney attempted to redirect to reassert motive, intention, maternal concern. But intention doesn't undo method. Then came the omissions. My attorney asked about device backups. She said she'd complied. He asked about missing date ranges. She said they must have been lost. He asked if she'd attempted recovery. She said she didn't think it was necessary. The silence after that answer was long. Too long. The judge asked a follow-up. Why wouldn't it be necessary? My wife hesitated. That hesitation was new. She gave an answer reasonable on the surface, but it contradicted an earlier statement about thoroughness. Not by much, just enough. Enough is all the law needs. By the time the audio was introduced, not played, just identified, the atmosphere had changed. The room wasn't hostile. It was attentive in a way that strips performance of oxygen. My wife's confidence had shifted into control mode. Control mode requires dominance. Dominance doesn't play well in court. When her attorney objected, it sounded reflexive rather than strategic. When the objection was overruled, she didn't look surprised. She looked annoyed. That reaction told me everything. She had come expecting affirmation. What she was receiving was examination. As the session adjourned for the day, she stood quickly gathering her things with sharp movements. She didn't look at me. She didn't need to. In her mind, she hadn't lost anything yet. She still believed the story could be corrected, clarified, reasserted. She still believed the system favored momentum over truth. She still believed this was manageable. That belief was the last advantage she had. The calm didn't feel like relief. It felt like pressure equalizing. After the first day of the hearing, nothing dramatic happened. No rulings from the bench, no visible fallout. The courtroom emptied the way it always does, quietly, efficiently, as if nothing significant had just begun to shift beneath the surface. That kind of calm is dangerous. It gives people permission to relax at the exact moment they should be alert. I walked out without looking back. Not because I was avoiding her, but because there was nothing left to observe. Everything that mattered was already in motion, no longer dependent on my attention. Outside, the air felt neutral. Not cold, not warm, just present. I stood for a moment on the courthouse steps, watching people move past me, each one carrying a life untouched by what had just unfolded inside. This was the calm before consequence. I didn't review the hearing in my head. I didn't replay answers or imagine alternate responses. That kind of reflection belongs to people who still think outcomes can be managed emotionally. Mine couldn't. They were procedural now. That afternoon, my attorney sent a short message. No commentary, no reassurance. Good positioning. We stay the course. That was all. I went back to my routine. Same drive, same meals, same quiet evenings. The predictability wasn't comfort, it was containment. The less my external behavior changed, the harder it was for anyone to claim internal instability. Across town, I knew the calm was being misread. My wife had always mistaken silence for surrender. In her world, escalation only mattered when it was visible. Hidden momentum didn't register. She believed the absence of immediate correction meant validation. That belief was doing the work for us now. In the days that followed, she didn't pull back. She leaned forward. Additional messages to her attorney. Supplemental explanations. Clarifying notes meant to tighten loose ends. Each one added material to a record that was already heavy. The calm made her efficient. Efficiency creates output. Output creates exposure. I didn't block it. I didn't interrupt it. I didn't try to slow it down. I let the calm do what it always does to people who think they're safe. It lowers their guard. In the quiet, I prepared nothing new. There was no next move to design, no reaction to plan. The sequence ahead had already been decided weeks earlier, locked into filing schedules and evidentiary order. That was the strange part. The calm wasn't empty because nothing was happening. It was full because everything that mattered was already decided. I slept better than I had in months. Not because I felt vindicated, but because I no longer felt uncertain. Uncertainty is exhausting. Certainty, even when it carries risk, allows rest. The next hearing date was weeks away. Long enough for confidence to grow. Long enough for narratives to expand. Long enough for mistakes to compound. That was intentional. Final calm isn't about peace, it's about stillness at the exact moment the ground beneath someone's certainty begins to fracture, and they don't feel it yet. I knew what was coming next, and so did the record. The first strike wasn't loud. It wasn't theatrical. No raised voices. No sudden revelations meant to stun the room. It arrived the way truth often does in court, quietly, after everyone thinks they already understand the shape of the case. The hearing resumed on a Wednesday morning. My wife entered with the same posture she'd used for months, composed, assured, prepared to clarify rather than defend. She believed the storm had passed, that what remained was interpretation, not exposure. My attorney waited. He didn't open with the recording. He didn't mention manipulation. He asked for the record to be reviewed. Specifically, he requested that the court revisit one narrow point: the origin of my daughter's language during early testimony. It sounded harmless. The judge allowed it. The evaluator was called again, not to restate conclusions, but to explain methodology. How language patterns are assessed. How consistency across settings can indicate coaching. How certain phrases, particularly abstract emotional descriptors, are rarely produced spontaneously by children under pressure. The evaluator cited examples, not hypotheticals. Examples already in the record. The room leaned in. My wife shifted slightly. Just once. Then came the comparison. My attorney introduced two transcripts side by side, one from a counseling intake note my wife had submitted, the other from my daughter's testimony weeks later. He didn't accuse. He asked the evaluator to read them aloud, line by line. The overlap wasn't identical, but it was unmistakable. The same emotional framing, the same sequence of fear, the same phrasing adjusted just enough to sound younger. The evaluator paused. This is consistent with coached recall, they said. Not fabricated memory, but directed narrative. That distinction mattered. It meant intent. My wife's attorney objected too late. The words were already on record. Then my attorney moved carefully to the next step. He asked the court to consider a limited exhibit, the audio. Not the full file. Not the most damning portion, just the opening seconds. Enough to establish context, enough to shift posture. The judge agreed. The room fell quiet. The recording played. Say it exactly like this. No emotion, no anger, just instruction. The sound of paper moving, a pause, a correction, again. My wife didn't react at first. She stared straight ahead, lips pressed together as if waiting for something to interrupt the moment. When nothing did, her jaw tightened. She looked toward her attorney, then back at the bench. The judge asked a single question. Is that your voice? Silence. Her attorney answered for her, requesting a brief recess to confer. Denied. The judge repeated the question. My wife swallowed. Yes, she said. The first strike landed there, not in the recording itself, but in what followed. My attorney asked if she'd ever denied telling her daughter what to say. She said yes. He asked if she'd described her role as encouraging honesty, not scripting responses. She said yes. He asked if she'd signed filings affirming that distinction. She hesitated, then said yes again. The judge looked down at the record. The strike wasn't fatal. Not yet. But it changed everything. The room no longer treated my wife as a narrator. She was now a subject. Every word would be measured against evidence, not empathy. She tried to recover. She explained the recording as guidance, support, help during a confusing time. She insisted context mattered, that a single phrase didn't represent her intent. The evaluator was asked to respond. They did. In clinical terms, they said, instruction on phrasing and emotional timing constitutes coaching regardless of intent. That sentence closed a door my wife hadn't realized was still open. The judge ordered the remainder of the recording admitted into evidence for review. Not played, logged, preserved. The hearing adjourned shortly after. No ruling, no commentary. But when we stood to leave, the dynamic had shifted. My wife no longer gathered her things calmly. Her movements were tight controlled. She avoided eye contact, not with me, but with the bench. She had expected debate. She had encountered documentation. That was the first strike, not a knockout. But a wound that couldn't be explained away. And wounds like that have a way of bleeding into everything that follows. Panic doesn't announce itself. It leaks. After the first strike, my wife didn't unravel in public. She didn't shout or break down or plead. What changed was subtler and far more telling. Her certainty fractured, and everything she did afterward was an attempt to seal the cracks before anyone else noticed. She started talking too much. Not in court. Outside of it. Emails to her attorney multiplied overnight, long, rambling messages filled with explanations that hadn't been requested. She began clarifying things no one had challenged, yet preemptively defending decisions that hadn't been questioned. That's how panic works. It argues with the future. In the next hearing session, her posture had shifted, still composed but tight, shoulders squared too rigidly, hands folded with deliberate restraint. She listened less and prepared responses more. The judge noticed. Judges always notice when listening stops. When questioned again about the audio, she didn't deny it this time. She reframed it, said it was a moment taken out of stress, claimed she was helping a frightened child find words for emotions too big to hold alone. The phrasing sounded practiced, but now practice worked against her. The evaluator was asked to respond not about the content, but about the behavior, about the impulse to correct phrasing, about the insistence on emotional timing. In moments of fear, the evaluator said children don't need scripts, they need safety. That sentence cut deeper than accusation ever could. My wife tried to regain ground by shifting focus. She brought up my silence again, my lack of visible emotion, my refusal to confront her earlier. She implied that my restraint was manipulation, that my calm was calculated. That argument might have worked months earlier. Now it sounded defensive. The judge asked a question that stopped her momentum cold. If your concern was safety, he said, why was instruction necessary? She hesitated. That hesitation stretched longer than any answer she'd given before. Her attorney stepped in, objecting on relevance. Overruled. She answered anyway. I didn't want her to get confused, she said. Confused by what? The question hung there unanswered. That was the panic moment, not when she raised her voice or lost control, but when the logic of her story collapsed inward. Each explanation required another explanation. Each clarification introduced a new inconsistency. By the end of the session, her narrative wasn't wrong. It was crowded. Too many moving parts. Too many justifications. Too many reasons for behavior that should have required none. Outside the courtroom, the pressure followed her. Discovery responses came back rushed. Incomplete. File structures inconsistent. Metadata that didn't align with earlier claims of thoroughness. Attempts to explain missing data created more questions than they answered. My attorney didn't comment. He didn't need to. The court ordered supplemental disclosures. That order mattered. It meant the judge no longer assumed good faith. From that point forward, compliance wasn't expected, it was required. The panic deepened. My wife requested continuances, asked for extensions, claimed scheduling conflicts that hadn't existed before. Her attorney tried to slow the pace to regain control of timing. The court denied the delays. Momentum had shifted. And panic, once exposed to structure, accelerates its own collapse. During a recess, I watched her from across the hallway. She spoke rapidly into her phone, pacing in short, tight steps. When she noticed me, she stopped abruptly, turned away, and lowered her voice. She wasn't afraid of me. She was afraid of the record. Back inside, the judge summarized the day's proceedings with careful neutrality. No conclusions, no reprimands. Just a note that the court had concerns and would continue to review the evidence in full. Concerns is a quiet word. In family court, it's devastating. As the session adjourned, my wife didn't gather her papers neatly anymore. She stuffed them into her bag, one folder slipping to the floor. She picked it up quickly, glancing around as if someone might have seen. I didn't look at her. There was no satisfaction in watching panic, only confirmation. Because panic doesn't create mistakes, it reveals them. And once revealed, they don't disappear. They accumulate, they wait, they become the foundation for the final question no one can answer without telling the truth. The kill shot didn't come with raised voices or a dramatic pause. It came with a document. On the final day of the evidentiary hearing, the courtroom felt different, not tense, not expectant, but settled. The kind of atmosphere that forms when everyone understands that something is about to end, even if they don't yet know how. My wife arrived late. Not rushed, just miscalculated. She assumed there would be time to adjust to respond to reframe. Panic had convinced her that speed could still outrun consequence. It couldn't. My attorney stood and asked permission to introduce the final exhibit. He didn't describe it as decisive. He called it clarifying. The judge allowed it. The exhibit was not the audio. That had already done its work. This was metadata. Phone extraction logs. Timestamp alignment. Device usage records tied directly to the nights my wife had claimed nothing unusual occurred. The data showed activation times, recording durations, file transfers, technical facts stripped of interpretation. Numbers don't argue. They confirm. The timeline appeared on the screen. On the left, the nights my wife rehearsed with our daughter. On the right, the counseling sessions and court filings that followed. The overlap wasn't suggestive. It was exact. My attorney asked a single question. "Do you recognize these timestamps?" My wife stared at the screen. She didn't answer. The judge repeated the question. She shook her head slightly as if that motion alone could dissolve what was being shown. "No," she said. "I don't know what that is." The forensic specialist was sworn in, calm, precise, unimpressed by narrative. They explained how the data was collected, verified, and cross-checked, how file creation matched device activity, how the recordings had been accessed repeatedly in the days leading up to testimony. Rehearsal wasn't inferred anymore. It was logged. My wife's attorney objected too late again. The foundation had already been laid. The objection was overruled. Then came the question that ended everything. "Did you delete any recordings after the restraining order was issued?" The room went still. My wife's eyes flicked to her attorney. He didn't move. She answered anyway. "No." The forensic specialist was asked to respond. They did. Recovered files, partial deletions, residual data fragments, proof not only of recording but of attempted erasure. The judge closed his folder. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't scold. He didn't lecture. He stated findings, that the child's testimony had been materially influenced, that evidence showed deliberate instruction and rehearsal, that the court had been misled, that corrective action was required. The restraining order was vacated. The prior custody arrangement was set aside. Temporary sole custody was granted to me pending final determination. Supervised contact was ordered for my wife. The kill shot wasn't punishment, it was reclassification. From concerned parent to manipulator. From narrator to respondent. My wife didn't cry. She didn't protest. She sat perfectly still as if movement itself had become dangerous. Her attorney leaned in to whisper something. She didn't respond. The judge addressed one final matter. The court would refer the case for further review regarding misuse of testimony and potential sanctions. That referral mattered more than any custody order. It meant the consequences wouldn't stop here. When the hearing ended, no one rushed out. People gathered papers slowly, carefully, as if afraid to disturb what had just settled into place. I didn't look at my wife. There was nothing left to say. The record had spoken. And records once closed don't reopen for regret. After the ruling, life didn't rush back into place. It settled. Quietly. Carefully. As if everything around me understood that noise would only damage what was already fragile. My daughter came home 2 days later, not delivered with ceremony, not escorted by social workers or officials, just a car pulling into the driveway at dusk, the sound of tires on gravel, a door opening and closing. She stood there with a backpack that looked heavier than it should have been, older than it had any right to look. I didn't kneel. I didn't reach out immediately. I knew better now. Children who have been handled learn to measure every movement. So I waited. She stepped forward first. Her hug was hesitant, brief, unfinished, but real. No lines, no timing, no instruction. That was how I knew it mattered. The house felt different with her inside. Not warmer, not happier, just honest. Sounds returned in fragments, the refrigerator humming, floorboards responding to weight, the subtle rhythm of another person breathing nearby. We didn't talk about court. We didn't talk about her mother. We talked about school lunches, about a book she'd started, but hadn't finished, about how quiet the house felt now that no one was whispering behind closed doors. That last comment stayed with me. No one was whispering anymore. The court's decision had consequences beyond custody. My wife's access was restricted, supervised, scheduled, documented. No private conversations, no unsupervised preparation. The authority she once exercised freely was now conditional. She contested nothing. She couldn't. Her attorney withdrew weeks later, officially due to irreconcilable differences. Unofficially because the case had become radioactive. Referrals followed. Professional review boards don't move quickly, but they move thoroughly. Counselors reassessed. Reports were amended. Earlier assumptions quietly retracted. No one apologized. Systems rarely do. But records changed. That mattered more. Social consequences arrived in a different way. Friends who had once avoided eye contact began offering tentative greetings. Conversations reopened cautiously, as if people were testing whether the story had truly shifted. I didn't explain. I didn't need to. The silence that followed exposure does the explaining for you. At work, nothing changed and everything did. I was no longer the man people tiptoed around, the one with the situation. I was just present again. Reliable. Unremarkable. That normalcy felt earned. My daughter adjusted slowly. Some nights she woke up disoriented, asking what day it was, whether she had to remember something important, whether someone would be upset if she forgot. I answered the same way every time. No. And I meant it. We set new routines, not to distract, but to anchor. Breakfast at the same time. Walks after dinner. Homework at the table where no one recorded anything. Trust doesn't return because it's promised. It returns because it's practiced without pressure. As for my wife, I saw her once more across a supervised visitation room. She looked smaller, not physically, structurally, like someone whose authority had been removed and replaced with observation. She didn't look at me. She watched our daughter carefully, speaking softly, choosing words with visible effort. No one told her what to say anymore. That I realized was the real consequence. Not custody loss, not professional scrutiny, but the absence of control. The legal aftermath continued quietly. Filings, compliance checks, review dates set months out, nothing dramatic. Justice, when it works, rarely is. It doesn't celebrate, it stabilizes. And in that stability, something unexpected happened. I stopped thinking about what I had lost. Because what remained quiet mornings, unfiltered conversations, a child who no longer paused before answering was more than restoration. It was correction. The story didn't end with vindication. It ended with reality reclaiming space. There was no celebration, no moment where I stood alone and felt victorious, no surge of relief that demanded expression. What followed the end of the case was not joy but clarity, the kind that arrives only after noise has been stripped away. Weeks later, I found myself alone in the house one evening while my daughter slept upstairs. The lights were low, the air was still. Nothing in the room demanded attention. That was new. For a long time, every silence had felt temporary, like something waiting to be filled with accusation or explanation. Now it was just silence, neutral, uninterested in drama. I sat at the table where so many conversations had once been staged. No papers spread out, no phone recording, no one watching for reaction, just wood, just time. My daughter no longer paused before speaking. She no longer checked my face for cues. When she forgot something, she laughed instead of panicking. When she was upset, she didn't search for the right words, she used her own. That change mattered more than the ruling ever could. I never told her what her mother had done. I didn't need to. Children don't heal by being informed. They heal by being allowed to exist without pressure. The truth, when it belongs to them, finds its own moment. One afternoon, months later, she asked me a simple question while we were driving. Why did things feel so heavy before I kept my eyes on the road? Because too many people were trying to control how things looked, I said, instead of how they were. She nodded, satisfied with that. That was enough. As for my wife, the consequences continued quietly. Reviews, limitations, a reputation that no longer matched the one she had carefully built. No public shaming, no dramatic downfall, just doors that didn't open the way they used to. People like to imagine justice as a moment, a verdict, a sentence, a punishment that feels proportional to the harm caused. In reality, justice is erosion. It removes the ability to repeat the behavior. It takes away the tools that made the harm possible. My wife didn't lose everything. She lost control. And that was permanent. I never spoke about the case again unless required. Not because I was hiding it, but because it no longer needed a voice. The record existed. The findings stood. Nothing I could say would add weight to what was already documented. I returned to the kind of life I had before everything broke open. Not unchanged, but corrected. I became more deliberate, less accommodating, not colder, but clear about where silence was strength and where it had once been misused. The house held no tension now, only history. Sometimes late at night I thought about the first day in court, the moment my daughter's voice carried words that weren't hers. I remembered how the room believed them, and I understood something then that I hadn't before. Truth doesn't require urgency. It doesn't need to be loud. It waits. It allows lies to expand until they collapse under their own weight. In the end, no one applauded. No one acknowledged what it took to stand still while everything moved against you. That was fine. The point was never to be seen as right. The point was to make sure a child was never used as a weapon again. And that finally was done. There was no celebration, no moment where I stood alone and felt victorious, no surge of relief that demanded expression. What followed the end of the case was not joy but clarity, the kind that arrives only after noise has been stripped away. Weeks later, I found myself alone in the house one evening while my daughter slept upstairs. The lights were low, the air was still. Nothing in the room demanded attention. That was new. For a long time, every silence had felt temporary, like something waiting to be filled with accusation or explanation. Now it was just silence, neutral, uninterested in drama. I sat at the table where so many conversations had once been staged. No papers spread out, no phone recording, no one watching for reaction, just wood, just time. My daughter no longer paused before speaking. She no longer checked my face for cues. When she forgot something, she laughed instead of panicking. When she was upset, she didn't search for the right words, she used her own. That change mattered more than the ruling ever could. I never told her what her mother had done. I didn't need to. Children don't heal by being informed. They heal by being allowed to exist without pressure. The truth, when it belongs to them, finds its own moment. One afternoon, months later, she asked me a simple question while we were driving. Why did things feel so heavy before I kept my eyes on the road? Because too many people were trying to control how things looked, I said, instead of how they were. She nodded, satisfied with that. That was enough. As for my wife, the consequences continued quietly. Reviews, limitations, a reputation that no longer matched the one she had carefully built. No public shaming, no dramatic downfall, just doors that didn't open the way they used to. People like to imagine justice as a moment, a verdict, a sentence, a punishment that feels proportional to the harm caused. In reality, justice is erosion. It removes the ability to repeat the behavior. It takes away the tools that made the harm possible. My wife didn't lose everything. She lost control. And that was permanent. I never spoke about the case again unless required. Not because I was hiding it, but because it no longer needed a voice. The record existed. The findings stood. Nothing I could say would add weight to what was already documented. I returned to the kind of life I had before everything broke open. Not unchanged, but corrected. I became more deliberate, less accommodating, not colder, but clearer about where silence was strength and where it had once been misused. The house held no tension now, only history. Sometimes late at night, I thought about the first day in court, the moment my daughter's voice carried words that weren't hers. I remembered how the room believed them, and I understood something then that I hadn't before. Truth doesn't require urgency. It doesn't need to be loud. It waits. It allows lies to expand until they collapse under their own weight. In the end, no one applauded. No one acknowledged what it took to stand still while everything moved against you. That was fine. The point was never to be seen as right. The point was to make sure a child was never used as a weapon again. And that finally was done.